Every place has a personality. Today, let's meet Cuba, a place of vintage cars, music, history, stories. But what really makes Cuba stand out? Let's find out. Who is Cuba? Before we talk about classic cars, music, or cigars, let's meet Cuba first. If Cuba were a person, it would probably be someone with endless stories to tell, someone nostalgic, someone resilient, someone who has changed over time, yet somehow never lost its identity. Cuba sits in the Caribbean, just 90 miles south of Florida. It's home to more than 11 million people and is the largest island in the region. Spanish is spoken almost everywhere. And Havana, its capital city, has been watching history unfold for more than 5 centuries. Over time, Spanish traditions, African influences, and Caribbean culture blended together to create something entirely unique. That's why Cuba often feels familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. You'll recognize parts of it, but you'll also find moments that make you stop, look around, and think, this place really is different. And perhaps that's the best way to describe Cuba, not as a destination, but as a personality waiting to be discovered. Why are there so many classic cars? One of the first things people notice about Cuba isn't the beaches or the food. It's the cars, bright colors, chrome details, Chevrolets, Cadillacs, convertibles, vehicles that seem like they belong in another era. At first glance, they almost feel like movie props. But in Cuba, they're simply part of everyday life. For decades, importing new vehicles was extremely difficult, so people adapted. They repaired what they had, rebuilt engines, found creative solutions, and kept these cars alive for generations. Over time, they became much more than transportation. They became symbols of resilience, of creativity, and perhaps even of Cuba itself. Today, riding through Havana in a vintage convertible isn't just sightseeing. It's one of the best ways to experience the city, especially near sunset when the light reflects off colorful buildings and the Malecón begins to fill with people. If you decide to take a ride, agreeing on the price beforehand is always a good idea. And while many visitors come for the photos, most leave remembering the feeling. Because in Cuba, even getting from one place to another can feel like stepping into another time. Why does Havana feel frozen in time? Havana doesn't really try to impress you. It simply exists, with faded facades, open balconies, colonial buildings, music drifting through old windows, and people who seem to have mastered the art of slowing down. Walking through old Havana feels less like visiting a city and more like stepping inside a memory. Some buildings have been beautifully restored, others still carry the marks of time. And strangely enough, that's part of Havana's charm. It doesn't feel polished, it feels real. You don't need a strict itinerary here. Some of the best moments happen between destinations, turning into a quiet street, finding a small cafe, listening to musicians playing in a hidden courtyard, or simply sitting by the Malecón and watching the city move around you. Early mornings are especially beautiful. The streets are quieter, temperatures are cooler, and Havana slowly wakes up around you. It's a city that rewards curiosity. And perhaps that's why so many people leave feeling like they haven't just visited Havana, they've experienced it. What foods should you try in Cuba? Meeting a country also means meeting its food. And Cuban food is all about comfort, tradition, and family. One of the dishes you'll hear about most often is ropa vieja, slow-cooked shredded beef served with rice and beans. Simple, but deeply loved. Another classic is moros y cristianos, black beans and rice, a dish you'll find in many homes and restaurants across the country. Then there's Cuban coffee, small, strong, sweet, and part of everyday life. Coffee here isn't usually something people rush through. It's a pause, a conversation, a moment to slow down. If you're looking for a more authentic experience, family-owned restaurants known as paladares are often worth visiting. And as with many destinations, taking a quick look at the menu before ordering can save you from surprises later. Food in Cuba may not always be elaborate, but it often feels honest, and sometimes that's exactly what people remember most. What places should you visit? Cuba may not be the biggest country in the world, but it has a surprising amount to offer. And perhaps the most difficult part isn't deciding whether to visit Cuba. It's deciding where to spend your time. Most journeys begin in Havana, a city filled with history, music, and endless details waiting to be noticed. But beyond the capital, Cuba reveals completely different personalities. Viñales feels peaceful, rolling tobacco fields, limestone mountains, horse-drawn carts, and landscapes that seem almost untouched by time. It's also where many of the world's famous Cuban cigars begin their journey. Varadero, on the other hand, tells a different story. White sand beaches, crystal clear water, and a slower pace built around relaxation. Then there's Fusterlandia, a colorful neighborhood transformed into an open-air art project, filled with mosaics, creativity, and unexpected corners. And of course, there's the Malecón. More than just a seaside promenade, it's where people meet, talk, play music, watch the sunset, and simply enjoy being outside. The truth is, Cuba isn't a destination you rush through. Many travelers arrive expecting to see landmarks, but leave remembering moments instead. A conversation, a view, a song, or an evening spent watching the city come alive. And perhaps that's the best way to experience Cuba. Leave room for the unexpected, because some of its most memorable places are the ones you never planned to visit. Why is music everywhere? In many places, music is something people listen to. In Cuba, it often feels like something people live. Walk through Havana long enough and you'll probably hear it. A guitar in the distance, someone singing from a balcony, musicians gathering in a plaza, or a small band performing inside a neighborhood restaurant. Music isn't reserved for special occasions here. It's woven into everyday life. Cuban music has traveled far beyond the island itself, from son cubano and salsa to jazz and Afro-Cuban rhythms. Its influence can be heard all around the world, but hearing it in Cuba feels different, because here, it doesn't feel like a performance. It feels natural, like an extension of daily life. And perhaps that's why visitors often describe Cuba as energetic without feeling rushed, alive without feeling overwhelming. If you stop to listen for a while, you'll notice something interesting. People don't just watch musicians. They interact, they dance, they sing along. They become part of the moment. And while many travelers arrive expecting architecture or history to leave the biggest impression, for some, it's the soundtrack of Cuba they remember most. What is daily life like in Cuba? For many travelers, Cuba doesn't just look different. It feels different. Life here moves at its own pace. People spend more time outside. Neighbors chat from balconies, families gather in parks, and somehow conversations often seem to matter more than schedules. But daily life in Cuba can also surprise visitors. Shopping feels different from what many people are used to. Some products may not always be available, and stores can look quite different from supermarkets in Europe or North America. Because of that, planning ahead can make your trip much easier. Bringing personal medication is usually a good idea, since some essentials can be harder to find than in many other destinations. The same goes for snacks or products you use regularly. You might not find your favorite international brands everywhere. Internet access has improved significantly in recent years, but it can still feel slower or less consistent than what many travelers expect. That's why downloading offline maps, translation apps, and important travel information before arriving is always worth considering. Cash also tends to make everyday experiences smoother, especially in smaller businesses where cards may not always be accepted. And despite these differences, many visitors say Cuba feels surprisingly social. People spend more time outdoors, talk more, and seem a little less connected to screens than in many other parts of the world. Life in Cuba moves differently, and for many travelers, that's exactly what makes it so memorable. What makes Cuba economically different? To understand Cuba a little better, it also helps to understand how the country works, because Cuba feels different, not only culturally, but economically as well. Tourism plays a huge role in everyday life. Many restaurants, guest houses, transportation services, and local businesses depend heavily on visitors. But tourism isn't the whole story. Cuba is also known around the world for its cigars. For generations, tobacco has been one of the country's most recognizable products. And in places like Viñales, you can still see farmers growing tobacco using traditional methods passed down through families. Coffee has its place too, as does agriculture, local production, and small private businesses that have become increasingly visible over the years. For travelers, these economic differences often become noticeable quite quickly. Prices can vary, payment methods may feel different, and everyday experiences don't always work exactly as they do in Europe or North America. That's why many visitors prefer bringing euros rather than dollars, as exchanging euros is often easier. Using official exchange locations is generally the safest option, and before taking a taxi, booking an experience, or making a purchase, confirming the price beforehand can save a lot of confusion later. Some visitors even enjoy negotiating prices in local markets. Others prefer fixed prices and organized tours. Neither approach is right or wrong. It's simply part of understanding how things work here. And perhaps that's what makes Cuba so interesting. Traveling here isn't just about seeing new places. It's also about learning different ways of living, different ways of doing business, and different ways of looking at everyday life. Is Cuba safe? One question almost every traveler asks before visiting Cuba, and overall, the answer is yes. Compared to many destinations across Latin America, Cuba is generally considered a relatively safe place to visit. Violent crime remains uncommon, and many travelers say they feel comfortable walking around tourist areas even during the evening. That said, no destination is completely free from inconvenience, and Cuba is no exception. Some visitors experience persistent sales offers. Others encounter unofficial guides or people trying to encourage them into restaurants, bars, or shops. In most cases, a polite but confident response is enough. Understanding prices beforehand can also make a big difference. Whether it's a taxi ride, a souvenir, or an organized activity, knowing what to expect usually makes the experience much smoother. Keeping valuables secure, using official transportation whenever possible, and exchanging money through trusted locations are all sensible habits. Not because Cuba is dangerous, but because they're good travel habits almost anywhere in the world, and perhaps that's what many visitors appreciate most. Cuba often feels welcoming, relaxed, and surprisingly social. People spend time outdoors, children play in parks, music fills public spaces, and everyday life unfolds in the open. For many travelers, that atmosphere becomes one of the most memorable parts of the journey. Why does Cuba stand out? Cuba doesn't try to compete with destinations built around luxury. It doesn't try to be the newest or the fastest. And that's precisely what makes it memorable. It's a place where history still feels present, where old cars continue to tell stories, where music belongs to the streets, and where everyday life feels just a little slower than what many of us are used to. Some travelers come for the beaches, others arrive because of the culture, the food, the cigars, or simply curiosity. But many leave remembering something much simpler: a conversation with a local, an evening by the Malecón, a cup of coffee shared between strangers, or the feeling of discovering a place that seems to exist in its own rhythm. Cuba won't be everyone's favorite destination. And perhaps that's exactly the point, because Cuba doesn't try to be like anywhere else. That's why people remember it, and that's why Cuba stands out. Thanks for meeting Cuba with us. Would you visit Cuba someday? Let us know in the comments. And if you'd like to keep exploring places with personality, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for our next destination. Every place has a personality, and we're only getting started. See you in the next destination. Esytravels.